Hello, this is my presentation for Death with Dignity Acts for Advanced Legal Research with Professor Gatton. I'm going to share my screen so you can see my presentation. Okay, so this is my presentation on Death with Dignity Acts. So I did a comparative study between Colorado, California, and Oregon. So what do I need to know about this topic? I need to know, what do death with dignity laws allow terminally ill adults to request? I need to know who gives state officials consent to prescribe medications to hasten people's death. Um, what laws are in place that vary between states? So again, just looking at the comparison between Colorado, California, and Oregon. What are the political agendas behind the Death with Dignity Act? So what are they trying to push here? What are the positives and negatives? What rights do individuals have against these acts or for the acts? What makes someone mentally competent to choose a death of this nature? So looking at the definitional aspects of mental competence and what each state does in regards to figure out who is mentally competent. How did legislation get passed in Colorado, California, and Oregon? Is suicide a crime? If the patient does have the right to die, what is the liability on the physician side? What qualifies as an individual as terminally ill? How much does this cost a patient who utilizes this option? How are families affected of someone who chooses to end their life this way? Which human rights does this death within the act violate? Does the Constitution give states power to allow people to die? And then what are the bioethical concerns regarding death with dignity acts? So I know that's a lot to unpack, but we will go through it given the research. So why Colorado, California, and Oregon? Colorado, California, and Oregon have all enacted certain acts to allow individuals to end one's life. So whether it be an physician-assisted suicide or death with dignity or end-of-life options, Colorado and California, they have an end-of-life options act, and Oregon enacted the Death with Dignity Act, and they were actually the first state to do so, as well as the first jurisdiction in the world to officially allow this. And so that was in 1997. So just a little bit of background information. And then, so what is assisted suicide? A lot of people can get this mixed up, like with euthanasia, and then just right to die. But assisted suicide is an accepted way to end one's life in many states, which is proper under the state's police power rights. This can be a slippery slope and could encompass many different life-threatening diagnoses. So the acts passed in Colorado, California, and Oregon. Each state calls the assisted suicide law something different. So the Death with Dignity Acts have been known to also be assisted suicide acts and end of life options act. So again, Colorado voters passed the End of Life Options Act on November 8, 2016. California's End of Life Options Act took effect on June 9th, 2016. This closely follows the model of Oregon's Death with Dignity Act with some modifications, and we'll get into that later when we look at the research and what it says about Oregon's Death with Dignity Act. And then again, Oregon enacted the Death with Dignity Act on October 27th, 1997. So my research strategy for this particular topic, I chose to research secondary sources first. And so that just provides myself, again, with like background information regarding Death with Dignity acts in Colorado, California, and Oregon, just to see what the foundational aspects of these acts are and how they enacted them and how the states do it differently. I first ran a search on Westlaw to see if there were any information regarding assisted suicide, Death with Dignity acts, and End of Life Options Acts, just to see what background information was out there. I also searched the secondary sources on LexisNexis, and found about the same amount of sources when searching similar terminology. I found that like they did have different sources, but it was the same information through and through. So I mean, just different delivery of same terminology. I noticed on both of the websites they had law dictionary definitions of assisted suicide and end of life options. I thought this was extremely helpful in differentiating like what is assisted suicide and what does that look like in terms of definitions, and just systematically laying it out and what that means in terms of end of life options versus assisted suicide versus euthanasia. I then utilized some other free secondary sources. Free secondary sources are probably my favorite way to research, just because you can find so many law review articles through utilizing free secondary sources. So again, this aided in background information on aspects of specific acts to Colorado, California, and Oregon. I looked up primary sources by utilizing the case law found on Westlaw, LexisNexis, and Fastcase, as well as previous secondary articles, in that they had cited specific case law and reference cases from law review articles. So a lot of the law review articles reference Supreme Court cases like Cruzan versus Cruzan and some other big Supreme Court cases where they basically decide, do you have a right to die? And then my searches on each website and database included different terminology. So I really tried to switch it up in terms of like what I was searching for so that I could maximize my efforts in getting basically your bang for your buck, right? Like searching the website thoroughly and getting all of the information. So I searched Death with Dignity Act, assisted suicide laws and regulations, End of Life Options Act, terminally ill, legal options, mental competence in dying with dignity, physician assisted suicide, which there was a vastly different sources that pulled up with assisted suicide versus physician assisted suicide. Bioethical issues of Death with Dignity Acts, that was one of my favorite to research just because of the law review articles. It merges like medicine and the law. Euthanasia and assisted dying, assisted suicide legalities, and constitutional issues with assisted suicide. And so my research strategy was basically to start out with secondary sources, move into the primary sources, and then really look on current awareness of like what is the world saying about this now. And I found like the secondary sources provided great historical foundation. Primary sources provided what the law says. And then the current awareness is like what is going on in the world now with this topic. And so this is my discussion of paid secondary sources. And so we're just going to go through this and I'll explain how I found each one. Okay, so on Westlaw, I went to the jurisdiction, I selected, so you go to jurisdiction, select Colorado, search End of Life Options Act, and then next look under secondary sources. And so I'm gonna click on this. Hopefully it brings it up on the screen. Oh, and of course it wants me to log in. Loading. Okay, hold on. Let's see. Sometimes I lose my mouse. Whoops. Okay, here we go. So when I go to Westlaw and I go to jurisdiction and I select Colorado and then search End of Life Options Act and then look under secondary sources, you'll find, if it loads, Colorado's End of Life Options Act. And this is from a law review article. Yeah, so you can type in End of Life Options Act look under secondary sources, and then go to the jurisdiction right here. And so the first one that pops up was actually really, really helpful in my research. And so this is from a law review journal and from a Colorado lawyer, and it talks about how the law works and potential issues within the End of Life Options Act. So it does a great job of summarizing how to request this medication. So basically, requesting the medication comes in two parts. So you have to make 2 oral requests to a doctor within a minimum of 15 days separating each request. And then it gives you what the written request is under the Colorado statute. So how to request the medication, and then the physician's role. And then also it is really helpful because it gives you a ton of background information on what the physician's role is. So it's going to be vastly different on if they are a part of dispensing the medication, which I feel like is really important in background information to understand. Are they just dispensing the medication and then you're going home and taking it? Or is this something that they're actually assisting with? And so it also defines what mental capacity is, duties, how it's administered, and then what mental capacity is. So an individual must have in order to exercise this right. So like if this is physician decides they are not mentally capable of making informed decisions, then the attending physician cannot prescribe the medication. And so again, like this would go back to like their duties of like healthcare providers. It also speaks to how exactly, again, it's administered. So this like individual states like has to be, again, an individual has to be conscious in order to get administered medication. And then I thought that this was really interesting. It had some statistics on in Colorado, people that utilize this option have life-ending illnesses, but about 1/3 of the people that request the medication don't actually end up using it. So I thought that that was really interesting. And then again, if we go back, this is another great background source. So again, advocacy for social change and improving, oh no, I've lost my mouse. Let's see if I can get it back. Sometimes I have to end the slideshow. Oops. Oh, here we go. Found it. Okay. So going back to the advocacy for social change and improving care and expanding options at the end of one's life. Again, I found this the same way I did Colorado's End of Life Options Act. So again, this is talks about Colorado and Oregon, but it's a great background source to understand the arguments on both sides that are for end of life options and against. So I thought that this was extremely helpful in just knowing which side, like what side has which arguments, because I knew a little bit about this topic just from bioethics whenever I took it with Professor McDougall, but again, didn't go into great lengths on what the arguments are. And so this law review article from Thomas M. Cooley Law Review, they discuss one of the major arguments that is associated with this is there are too many risks associated with the practice. So if the patients were permitted to make this choice, there would be harm. And what they're really looking at is statistically is the harm that it could be abused by minorities and uninsured people, that it could be then a form of abuse. So again, just like a vulnerable population, like this could be to their disadvantage because it could be abused. And then this attorney that wrote this, he spoke of how he represented a class of terminally ill Oregon citizens who wanted to have access to the Death with Dignity Act. And so the case was filed actually in federal court in Oregon, which was interesting because he's now making it seem like it's a federal question. And basically the scope of what the federal government can do is limited because they said they don't actually have the authority to reach into this realm. And additionally, there was a Commerce Clause argument from him, but the federal court system said there isn't enough impact on commerce to permit the federal government to reach in there. So the text of this, they look at the text of the statute, the legislative history in it, and the cases construing the statute, and they were all argued to make the point that the scope is just thus and not much more. And so they made the article that this was a states' right case, which I just think it's interesting how different individuals are arguing this, and just in terms of what the arguments are on both sides. So again, a great background source. And then on LexisNexis, I found, I found, like, if I go to LexisNexis and then go to Lexis Advance, and then I explore the content, click on secondary materials and search for death with dignity, then go to jurisdiction, and then I'll click on California. Oh, it's wanting me to log in. Hopefully I don't lose my mouse this time. I really liked this law review article because, again, it's death with dignity and assistance, a critique of the self-administration requirement in California's end-of-life option. So this is a law review article, and then it speaks of the Supreme Court's efforts regarding one's right to die. And so it talks about how states have normalized these efforts. However, the federal court still remains hesitant to legalize a patient's right to die. And so it focuses on California's End-of-Life Options Act and speaks of the various parts of it. So there's actually 4 different parts to California End-of-Life Options Acts. So if we go through the article, we can see like the state Supreme Court and then how it contrasts with Europe. But within this, it talks about part 1 of California's act addresses the history, development, and expansion of right to die legislation. And then part 2 discusses the current state of right to die legislation. Part 3 analyzes the purpose and practice of self-administration requirements in the United States and Europe. And then this also notes under California law, people will likely to be able to obtain administration assistance. So it negates the self-administration requirement. So really, Oregon is all about administering it themselves. So this would be a modification, even though it might mirror Oregon's Death with Dignity Act, it still has some modifications. And then part 4 proposes the removal of the self-administration requirement from California's legislation, essentially allowing a patient to access lethal medication if they meet all the other requirements. And so it also shows background information about various states as well. I really like this article because it speaks to Oregon's act and how one has to have residency in order to apply for assistance. So in order for Oregon to prescribe life-ending medications to their patients, there's like numerous steps that they have to take, right? So additionally, the doctor has to refer a patient to a counselor in Oregon, and then they must only have less than 6 months to live. And then the statute specifically states that no medication to end a patient's life in a humane and dignified manner shall be prescribed until the person performing the counseling determines that the patient is not suffering from a psychiatric or psychological disorder. Again, in Oregon, the patient is self-administering the medication themselves, and there's no requirement for them to supervise this. And so next on Lexis, I searched for physician-assisted suicide. So I found several law review journal articles. Again, this is looking for a good death, the elderly terminally ill's right to die by physician-assisted suicide. This speaks to how California is one of the most progressive states and in the nation and improving pain care. So it allows, basically it allows terminally ill patients to receive care in an environment where provision of good pain and symptom management is recognized as essential, and it's a basic human right. And then also in 2005, it talks about California state representatives, how they introduced the physician-assisted suicide legislation to the state legislature. And again, how it's like mirroring, oh no, I've lost my mouse again. How it's mirroring, let's see. Technical difficulty. Oh, okay, there we go. Okay, and then how it mirrors the Organ Death with Dignity Act. And so the proposed California legislation empowers terminally ill, mentally competent adult Californians to control the timing and manner of their death, subject to careful procedures of the court. And so I like this article because it lays out the foundation of how states like California utilize the Organ Act as a good model for state statutes who want to legalize physician-assisted suicide. So really, because Oregon was the first jurisdiction in the world, a lot of states look to them on how it can be utilized. And then on LexisNexis, next I search for the right to die with dignity. Oops. And this is another law review article that I found extremely helpful. It talks specifically about Oregon, California, and Colorado, and how they have remained in favor of legalizing assisted suicide, which encompasses both physician-assisted suicide and voluntary euthanasia. And again, we'll go in my free secondary sources, we'll go in depth and talk about those definitions of each of those. And then I really like this law review article because it speaks to defining like end of life care as well as physician assisted suicide and euthanasia, because we often clump all of them together, right? So like it can define all of these things and go through like the definitions and each one. So like it has end of life care, physician assisted suicide, euthanasia, and you go down and then it speaks about Oregon and how it was the first state. And it's just a really helpful law review article in terms of understanding how the different states do things. So it even has like Washington, Vermont, again, California, Colorado, but are the three that we're focusing on the comparative study. But it, like, for instance, in Colorado, if you look, it talks about on November 8th, Colorado voters approved the legalization, and then 56% of physicians in the Colorado Medical Society support this. So it's just really interesting in providing background information and then just understanding what each state is doing. Oh, I'm telling you, this mouse thing is going to be an issue. Oh, there we go. Okay. So next we're going to talk about discussion of free secondary sources. These are my favorite types of sources. So the free secondary sources, I love Hein Online. Like I love it. And so we'll look at Hein Online first. And I know that they have subscriptions, but they also have free access to certain journals. And so basically we'll be going through both. And then on the next slide, I'll talk about the step-by-steps on Hein Online and how I searched for each one. I really wish my mouse would show up. I'm so sorry. Okay, let's try this again. So on Hein Online, again, I go to databases, then law, journal, library, search Oregon's Death with Dignity Act, and physician-assisted suicide. So this is regulating death, Oregon's Death with Dignity Act, and the legalization of physician-assisted suicide. this just talks about the Organs Death with Dignity Act, how they ruled on the legality of assisted suicide in general. And so I really like this article. Again, I usually download it in the PDF format. That way I don't have to like search through the website. It's just like a quicker way. And then I can also save it. So whenever I download it, it just looks more like a document. But this is really interesting because it talks about United States Supreme Court cases. It goes into specific cases. This is from the Georgetown Law Journal. It speaks about the different parts of the act. And I just found it really helpful in providing, again, background information. It was really, really helpful for me. And then next on Hide Online, I search all databases basically, and then physician-assisted suicide in the Constitution. This is called Disorder in the Court, Physician-Assisted Suicide in the Constitution. This provided great background information. It's like it disappears. This provided great background information on the constitutionality of physician-assisted suicide. And so it had like Justice Robert Jackson's opinion, and it looks at the psychology behind, oh no. It looks at the psychology behind assisted suicide and goes into different arguments again. So like it talks about how Justice Stevens was for this and that he was openly explicit in stating the individual interest in hastening he was explicit in stating that individual interest in hastening their death is entitled to constitutional protection. And so he almost devoted all of his opinions on this topic and refuting the arguments against the existence of such a constitutional right, which I thought was interesting, because he said that the plaintiff's challenges were nothing more than facial challenges to the state statutes, which he was unwilling to endorse. So again, just a great article on background information. I, of course, always download it. And then if we go to the National Constitution Center, does the Constitution protect a right to die? This, again, is just a free online source that I found. I've looked several times on this website to find background information for like constitutionality questions, like bioethical issues, especially like with genetic modification and things like that. This article is, does the Constitution protect a right to die? It talks about the California governor at the time, it was Jerry Brown, and how he had to decide whether or not to sign the End of Life Options Act into law. And then talks about what the bill would allow people in advanced stages of terminal illness to obtain, which would be a lethal dose of drugs from their doctor, essentially. And so it goes into the background information on the constitutionality and if it's protected by the Constitution. And then in the Supreme Court, they argued that assisted suicide and the right to die was a liberty interest, which I thought was interesting. And it was protected by the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. So unfortunately, the court rejected this idea that assisted suicide was a fundamental liberty interest that was protected by the Due Process Clause. And then they analyzed it by going through the method of substantive due process analysis. And basically, in the end, they said the Constitution may not protect the right to die. So I thought that that was really interesting. Again, like super helpful in understanding like the constitutionality part of is the right to die protected. And so next we go into the Journal of Ethics, and you can I searched physician-assisted suicide in the law. This, again, was really, really interesting because it merges medicine and the law. And this is like one of the more fascinating things that I found, just because they have two main arguments basically that they talk about for legalizing this. And they talk about legalizing physician-assisted suicide and how it will cause pressure on terminally ill patients who fear their illness, and that they think it may be burdensome physically, emotionally, or financially, burdensome to their families or caretakers. So they choose this option basically out of a fear mentality. And then the second argument that this Journal of Ethics talks about is physician-assisted suicide is fundamentally incompatible with the physician's role as a healer. So it goes back into the history of medicine and what doctors are supposed to do, and they're supposed to heal patients. And so it said it would be difficult or impossible to control and would pose like serious societal risks. And I just think it's interesting because it merges like law versus professional ethics, and it goes into like what the bioethical issues are. Like, so yeah, it may be legal, but is it ethical? And so it really takes a hard look. Again, yeah, law versus professional ethics, why some physicians want to help. And it talks about the ethical dilemmas that you can go through, even though it is legalized in some states. And so then we get into dignity in dying. So I went to dignityindying.org. I searched the international examples, and then I went to Oregon. So you'll see like they have Oregon, Washington, California, Canada, Switzerland, and others. So this is actually a United Kingdom website, but this talks about how Oregon, how it has been legal for terminally ill and mentally competent adults to have assisted suicide since 1997. So again, just a great background source. The person, it talks about what the terminally ill person must be. So they have to be over 18, mentally competent, have a terminal illness that will lead to death in 6 months. So again, it's pretty short, but very informational. And then we get into the government General Assembly. Oh, let's see. This is just a summary, basically, of Oregon's assisted suicide law. So it talks about background information and like a summary of what it is. It also has the actual assisted suicide law here on this website. I really like how systematic this website is, just because it is a research report and it speaks to the dates and events when they passed it, and what is actually happening within Oregon right now with their assisted suicide laws. And then I went with deathwithdignity.org, and I selected California and Colorado. So again, on my next slide, I'm going to show you like a step-by-step of going through each one, which I think will really help with like Hein Online. But if you see this website, like you can go to California, you can go to deathwithdignity.org, and you can click on which states have this or what is happening in the legislation at these states. So in California, as you can see, like it'll say the current status, which I think is extremely helpful in knowing what's going on now. And so it'll tell you when it took effect. You can look at the full text of the statute. You can look at the legal challenges, resources for patients, resources for healthcare, polls, endorsements, take action, talks about the history. It's just really, really informative. And I like that you can go to different states. And so you can literally go over here to Colorado. It says the same thing, current status, resources. We can also go to Oregon. I just think it's really, really helpful in terms of making it really easy to navigate. And so those were some free secondary sources. Okay, so these are other free secondary sources that I found on Hein Online. So I'm going to show you, if I go to Hein Online, if it will, there we go. So I search bioethical issues, death with dignity, right? So whenever I go and I search Hein Online, if I go back, the article that we're going to look at, I just searched all databases. But basically bioethical issues, death with dignity. And you can see that there's going to be an article called The Right to Die. I think that's what I searched. Maybe I didn't. Let's see. Oops. Oh, I did. I went to, I'm sorry. I went to databases, law journal library, and then I searched The Right to Die with death with dignity. And so this article, I think was really, really helpful in just understanding like the law and the politics of assisted suicide. And so again, I download this in PDF format. I love researching bioethical issues because I think it provides a great foundational aspect of the law and the topic. And it's not just what the law says, it's what other lawyers are arguing. And so this goes into the definitional aspects of like common use labels. So it gave me ideas on what to search for in my terminology. So like euthanasia, I wasn't searching euthanasia before I did my background information on free secondary sources. So again, just really helpful. Let's see. Oh, and then also I searched for bioethical issue, physician-assisted suicide. This again was in the Law Journal Library on the databases on Pine Online. This is just a great, again, foundational aspect of bioethical issues. It also has some cases and what it talks about. And then I also searched on Pine Online constitutional issues with assisted suicide. So physician-assisted suicide as a constitutional right. Again, it talks about many cases. This one talks about Cruzan and Cruzan. I download it for an easier read. Euthanasia and assisted dying. I also searched for this on Heim Online. So regulating assisted dying in the Law Journal library. So basically the assumption, like legally and practical feasible for a legal system to enable a person who assists another. This has great definitional aspects as well. I just found it extremely helpful in background information with constitutional issues. And then I really like this, should we decriminalize physician-assisted suicide and physician-committed euthanasia? I really, really liked this Law Journal article. So it's of law and medicine. Again, when they merge like that, it just kind of brings everything together and you just understand, I think, more about the topic from a legal standpoint, but also from a medical standpoint. And so next we're going to jump into discussion of paid primary sources. I found a lot of primary sources on LexisNexis and Westlaw. So when I go to Lexis Advance, I explore the content type, state and legislation, and then I click on the specific state and then search end of life options. And so with this is the actual 2015 legislation bill history. I think that this is really, really interesting read, just like because it's California legislative bill history. And it talks about everything like systematically inside of it, of what it is, the summary, it defines various terms, what it allows, what it requires, and what it specifies. So I thought Lexis had, like, finding the document was relatively easy. And then next, if you select Colorado and then search death with dignity, let's see, it'll bring you up to the bills. So like, again, go to content type, state and legislation and clicked on the specific state. So again, this is the 2015 bill. text for Colorado, just talking about the requirements and the full text bill of what it is. And then next, if you select Oregon, search death with dignity, it's going to take you to it's going to take you to the Oregon annotated statutes. And so I just like the definitional aspects because sometimes you don't know within the acts, like, okay, informed decision, like what does that mean for that specific state? Or what does a patient mean in a specific state, or physician? Like so means a doctor licensed to practice medicine. So then they also cite the other ones. The annotated statutes for Oregon, I thought were extremely helpful as well. Again, this I really, really love because you can go through all of the various, the Oregon Death with Dignity Act. So like general provision, written requests. They even have form of the request, immunities and liabilities, safeguards, severability. So again, just a lot of great information on LexisNexis for a paid primary source. Then I went to Westlaw and looked at several different cases that were very prominent within this topic. So death with dignity. It's wanting me to log in again. Again, I go to Westlaw cases by U.S. Supreme Court. So if I start a new session, well, it took me to it, but so if I start a new session, I can go to United States Supreme Court, right? And then I can type in death with dignity or assisted suicide. I should have probably typed in physician assisted suicide, but it has like a bunch of cases. So like Washington versus Glucksberg is the main one. And then it has, if you see, like I typed in assisted suicide, Cruzan by Cruzan. So it goes to content type cases. And that's exactly what our link would have taken us to. And so this was a really interesting case. So basically the guardians of a patient, she was in a persistent vegetative state and was suffering. And the United States Constitution did not forbid Missouri from requiring that clear and convincing evidence of an incompetence wishes to withdraw end of life sustaining treatment. And the state Supreme Court did not commit constitutional error in concluding that it did not amount to clear and convincing evidence of patients' desire to cease hydration and nutrition. And so her parents were really struggling in this case with end of life options. We read this in bioethics. I thought it was really, really interesting. Again, just a great case for primary sources and understanding the topic. Oh, and then next on Westlaw, you can search case by state. So Lee versus State of Oregon. Again, I go in to the case by state and I can go and search, I can go and click on Oregon, do assisted suicide and see what cases come up on the side. But this, again, interesting case, Lee versus State of Oregon. So it's about medical doctor. They represented a subclass of a person who has the disability of a terminal disease. Even with medical treatment, they're being treated at the Oregon Health and Sciences Center. But it basically talks about like terminally ill patients and physician and residential care facilities. They challenged the constitutionality of Oregon's Death with Dignity Act. I just thought it was an interesting case to put on for the topic at hand. And then again, if you search case by state and you do search assisted suicide or death with dignity, you'll pull up a lot of cases for that specific state. So this is Oregon versus Ashcroft. This was a pretty big case. So the state of Oregon brought action seeking declaratory and injunctive relief, preventing federal enforcement of United States Attorney General's directive indicating that physicians who assist suicide of terminally ill patients pursuant to Oregon's Death with Dignity Act would be violating the Controlled Substance Act. So this was actually a really hot topic for Oregon, especially after they passed that act. So next I searched cases as a whole and search assisted suicide. So whenever I just like ran a huge search on Westlaw, again, it says Supreme Court, but if you save it and then search assisted suicide, several cases will come up. And so this terminally ill patients and physician brought action against Attorney General and district attorneys for declaratory and injunctive relief as to the legality of the physician's lethal drug. And then next I searched physician-assisted suicide, like cases as a whole. So I did assisted suicide and then physician-assisted suicide. And this I looked at, Donaldson versus Lundgren. So this was a patient that was terminally ill, and they were seeking declaration that the patient had a constitutional right, basically to die. They found that they didn't have a constitutional right to assisted death. So I thought it was interesting. This was in the Court of Appeals of California in 1992. So just going back a bit, just to seeing how progressive they have become and what they've done now. So that was discussion of paid primary sources. This is discussion of free primary sources. I found a lot of information from the California Department of Public Health Act, End of Life Option Act. So on the California Department of Public Health, you can actually go and look at the End of Life Option Act and what it's about, like the news on it, the actual statutes. And then I like this because it has annual reports, it has provider forms, patient forms. So a lot like that other website that we had looked at previously. It's just, again, really helpful. Oregon's Health Authority website, they, again, talk about the Death with Dignity Act. It has current reports, annual reports, forms. Again, just like super helpful. Public health's role, policy arguments, releasing information regarding the Death with Dignity Act. Just provides a great background information on this. And then the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, again, has like about the act, reporting requirements, annual statistical report. So if you click, like it'll go down and it'll have the 2019 data summary from 2017 to 2019. So it's pretty up to date. And then reporting requirements. Again, I just think that this is a great website to utilize. Like if you go to the specific state government websites, they have a lot of that information in forms that you would need to understand the topic at hand. And then the current awareness, I looked at the Federalist. And so I thought that this was like really, really current. One of the reasons why I like the Federalist is because it, again, has pretty up-to-date articles. So this is as coronavirus hits hospitals, the ugly specter of euthanasia raises its head. So it talks about increased physician-assisted suicide in the United States and how it's stripping the vulnerable of their equal rights in the American healthcare system. So it goes on to talk about how certain staff have to resuscitate a patient. It also talks about, disabled elderly at greatest risk of medical prejudice. So I thought it was really interesting. It talked about legalized assisted suicide greases the death slope. So, but it also incorporates coronavirus and how that pandemic is targeting the vulnerable, and basically how different concepts talk about like end of life death situations and how you can be trained to limit care for very ill coronavirus patients. So again, just really prominent of what's happening right now. This is Oh, Adirondack Daily Enterprise. I really passing the Medical Aid in Dying Act. So this was actually written on March 9th, 2020, basically saying it's time to pass New York's Medical Aid in Dying Act. They talked about Governor Cuomo and how he stated his support. And then also it talks about, what I really like is it talks about how Oregon's act was proven, and it was the first state again. Multiple studies have shown no cases of abuse or coercion or criminal charges. And then it just kind of correlates the acts from the states that have passed it. So I thought it was interesting. It was written on March 9th, 2020. And then America, the Just It review. Oops, I think it pulled up and then it didn't. I really like this review website. Again, this was January 15th. Massachusetts judge rejects right to physician-assisted suicide. Kind of just what's going on in the world and the current awareness, again, of what this looks like. So in Massachusetts, they actually don't have the right to the physician-assisted suicide, but their doctors can provide them information and advise them about medical aid in dying. So, I mean, that's a great first step. Not as progressive as Colorado, California, or Oregon, but they did say that allowing any type of suicide is too dangerous. So again, just a great article. The commentator, I really like this. Again, it has to do with bioethics and practice, assisted suicide, physician, or executioner. So this goes into talking about, like, again, the legal and ethical dilemmas of doctors. So like they're trained to think methodically and logically and scientifically, but what happens whenever the rationale behind physician-assisted suicide pops up? So like, are they going against what they were trained to do? So does it qualify them in the practice of saving lives? And then basically medicine that defines physician-assisted suicide, the definitional aspects, and then what the American Medical Association, how they strongly condemn this. And then it goes into death with dignity, and then how it promotes the legislature in different states. And then, the hour. This is another great article. I really like this current awareness website just because it has really up-to-date articles. This was written March 30th. Don't want to subscribe. So it talks about the nurse's perspective, which I think is really interesting, why they support it, and mostly because they are the ones that are seeing all of these patients suffering. And so again, it talks about nation's population have authorized medical aid in dying. So California, Colorado, Hawaii, it talks about Oregon, Washington beforehand. And then talks about the 10 jurisdictions, and then just different medical ethics journals within this, and then how the CDC defines the cause of death. So disease or injury that initiate events resulting in death. So again, just like a great background information. The last current awareness one, is Palo Alto Online. I like this. It's really easy to navigate. You can search for death for dying, and you can search for death with dignity, assisted suicide, physician-assisted suicide, end of life. So this is how a terminally ill woman used a new law to die with dignity. And so she was like in terminally ill and a lot of pain, and she utilized the act from California, the End of Life Options Act, to end her life last year. And so this is just talking about like how sometimes it often becomes unbearable whenever you have a terminal illness, and just what that can look like from a patient's perspective, so that we could fully understand the scope of what the End of Life Options Act could do for someone that is in that position. And so it talks about the End of Life Options Act, the median age, 76% of the patients in California that utilize it were 1689, and then 51% were female. And then more than 80% had at least some college education, more than 88% were white. So those are pretty like astounding statistics to understand just who utilizes this in California. again, when we look at California, Colorado, and Oregon, how they're vastly different, it's like Oregon, the Death with Dignity Act is really the mirrored act of what other states go off of, and they are allowing states to modify, what they have done and kind of go off their legislation, but they're self-administering the medication. California is not self-administering, the end-of-life options with California and Colorado, but still all very prominent in today's world in choosing the right to die. So we will see if the Supreme Court makes a decision that it is a liberty interest and you do have a right to die. And that is the end of my PowerPoint and the end of my topic. I really enjoyed this class. I really enjoyed researching. Thank you so much for the opportunity. So I'm going to stop recording. Thank you.